I'm Terry, and I'm an alcoholic. I have a few titles. I'm Reverend Dr. Terry Ellis. Got a lot of education. But for the purposes of this, I'm simply an alcoholic. And I want to share with you a little bit of my story. Everyone's story in addiction and recovery is both unique and very much the same. We all share a story of how alcohol and/or drugs took over our lives, drained our spirits, and threatened to end our lives. Some of us do die. I didn't, and here's my story. I was not raised around alcohol. My parents were not drinkers. The Ellises were not drinkers. I was raised in Kentucky, Southern Baptist. I don't really remember ever hearing a sermon about alcohol and how it was wrong or bad. I always knew that Jesus turned the water into wine, not grape juice. It's just that the Ellises didn't drink. It was not a part of our lives. It was not a part of my life growing up. As a teenager, I tasted it. As a college student, I tasted it. In my mid-30s, I tasted it. But to be honest with you, I just didn't like the taste. And so I didn't drink. That, and I suppose a kind of baseline fear about what it might mean to me or what it might do to me, was enough to keep me from drinking. I simply did not drink, not out of a religious conviction that it would be wrong to do so. I don't really believe that. But for me, it was enough to say, this is not something I want in my life. And so I didn't drink. Over the decades, on those rare occasions when I did take a sip, I would imagine that in my first 50 years of life, I had not drank enough alcohol to fill a Dixie cup. I just was not a drinker. Now, when I hit about age 50, some things began to pile up in my life. I began to have a few disappointments. I began to get a little depressed. Got real depressed, as I can see now and look back on it. And it kind of morphed into a kind of despair. And at age 53 or so, I decided to try wine to see if it would be something that would help me relax, maybe help me to sleep. And I found that I could enjoy wine. And that was the first time in my life that I ever drank to effect. That is, I drank enough alcohol to feel the effect. And I'm telling you, it worked until it didn't. But I felt that effect, and it was good. It relaxed me, it helped me to sleep for a little while, and it helped me to forget, and to tell you the truth, that's what I was looking for. Again, I was kind of depressed, despairing, and I just wanted to check out of life. For 50 years, I had not had anything to drink, and I felt like I was kind of entitled to just not be involved anymore. I wanted to check out. Now, when it comes to the effect of alcohol, there's nothing wrong with it for 90% of the population. People drink all the time, and they enjoy the effect, and that's perfectly fine. It's neutral. But in me, it stirred up something in my mind, and soon I was drinking more and more and more. I began by saying that I wouldn't have anything to drink except a glass of wine before dinner. And then I'd say, well, nothing until after 8 o'clock, and then nothing until after supper, and then maybe a glass with supper, and then it was all right after that, then nothing until after 5 o'clock, and then it's got to be 5 o'clock somewhere, and on it started, and it went and went and went. Now again, I did have some stresses at that time. Typical things, work and family. I lost my brother. He was murdered. I was age 52 or 53. But again, these are just the normal hardships of life. There was nothing really unique about them. But soon, I developed in my drinking a relationship with alcohol. I depended on it. It was my friend. And soon it became my master. But I didn't care. People ask me, well, how did you get to this point? How did it happen? And the best answer I have is a line from The Sun Also Rises, where one of the characters had been very wealthy and then he went broke. And they asked him, how did this happen? And he said, little by little and suddenly. And that's how I became an alcoholic. Little by little and then suddenly. I tried a lot of times to stop, half-heartedly at best. I was really convinced that I couldn't possibly be an alcoholic. I was adopted at birth. I don't really know what is in my genetic history. But the way my alcoholism came on, almost certainly one or both of my parents was alcoholic. That's the way it happened to me. I've got something in me, a genetic predisposition, some environmental factors, some volitional issues, and some spiritual issues that led me to become an alcoholic. I remember trying to control my drinking. One time I even made a chart of what I could drink and when I could drink. Literally made a chart. Let me tell you, if you got to make a chart to try to control your drinking, you got a problem that needs medical attention. I couldn't stick with that chart for 24 hours, but I didn't really care. I was entitled. I dismissed the protests of my wife and other family members. I didn't listen to their concerns. I just kept drinking. I relied on it, needed it. I got to the point where a kind of seminal image for me during my addiction was a window and the sun just beginning to come up. If I had slept that night, and there were so many nights where I saw every single hour, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I would see parts of every hour. And then I would watch that sun just begin to lighten that window, and I would curse the dawn. I was not exactly suicidal. I was not trying to kill myself in an active way, but I did not want to live. I didn't want to live through another night, and that dawn meant that I had lived to face another day. There was no pleasure for me in usual things that I enjoyed. I had pleasure blindness or anhedonia. I was deaf to all the happiness of the world. My addiction became all-consuming physically and mentally, and it eventually drained my spirit. Now, whenever I tell this kind of story, and people knowing me and my background and the things that I've done in life, my education, all this, they're a little bit puzzled. I try to explain to them what happens in the brain of an addict and what was happening in my brain. And it's hard for you to understand. I get that. But here's what it's like. If you have trouble relating to a loved one who has addiction, here's how you can relate to it. Try not eating for 3 days, and then don't think about food. If you don't eat for 3 days, a very primal part of your brain is going to tell you, get something to eat. I don't care what you have to do. It can be criminal. Just get something to eat. You got to have food. That's what it's like for an alcoholic or addict every single day with a drug and or alcohol. You crave it. It's all you can think about. A very primal part of my brain had begun to equate survival with the drug, and it hyper-prioritized the drug over everything that had previously been most important to me: God, my family, my health, everything. Some people say that insanity is doing the same thing and knowing that you're going to get the same result. Well, I would do the same thing over and over, knowing I'd get the same result, but I didn't care. I truly did not care. I had entered the realm of despair. I was living on memories, and I was pretty much hollow. Then one morning, a friend of mine at church called me and asked if he could come see me. I said, of course. So he said he'd be there at 10 o'clock. I had no idea what was going on. At 10 o'clock, he came in and he took a chair from around in front of my desk and pulled it over to behind my desk so I couldn't get out, I think. And then he leaned forward in a very caring way. He said, Terry, we need to get you well. I knew what he meant. I felt caught. I felt guilty. I felt ashamed. But to tell you the truth, there wasn't much of me left to care. I knew my life was over at that point. I knew my ministry was over. I had nothing to look forward to. But I became willing to just kind of put my life in his hands and do whatever he said. He told me to go to the doctor with him and do whatever the doctor said. And I agreed to go with him. I went to the doctor, and he recommended that I go to Palmetto Addiction Recovery Center in Rayville, Louisiana. I arrived there. I was confused. I was hopeless. My crumbling myth of success lay in shambles around me. But again, I just didn't much care. My despair was complete. Now, when I got there, I could look around and see a whole lot of people that were different from me. This might surprise you, but there aren't a whole lot of pastors with 35 years of experience from a Baptist background in treatment centers. But I was one of them. I was about 55 years of age. But somebody early on said, Terry, I want you to do this. I want you not to compare yourself with everybody else. I want you to identify what makes you the same. And that changed the whole perspective for me. I began to see that in spite of all the differences that we had a common brokenness. I got to a point where I could readily admit that I was powerless over alcohol and that my life had become unmanageable. There's a scene from a Denzel Washington movie called Flight. He's a pilot for an airline. The plane that he was piloting crashed. Now, he was heroic in saving many of the people and in saving the plane from total destruction. But he'd been drinking. And throughout the movie, it was a kind of wrestling match with him trying to avoid being caught and other people suspecting there was a problem, and it's back and forth. And finally, he's before the hearing, and they ask him some things about drinking. He denies it. But then a kind of guilt seeps in, an awareness, a desire to be clean and to be honest comes upon him. And he quietly says, I'm an alcoholic. And there's a hush over the hearing. What did you say? I'm an alcoholic. God help me, I'm an alcoholic. It's a kind of realization for him at the same time that he admits it. I got to that point where I thought, I'm an alcoholic. God help me, I'm an alcoholic. And you know what? God did help me. So I began to learn about my addiction. I began to learn about how to get well, how to get into recovery. Several weeks into treatment, I heard again the music of the spheres. I learned that God had never left me. I never would have believed that. But God for me during that time was like a distant bonfire. I could see the light, but I couldn't feel any heat, and I just wasn't concerned to try to work up enough effort to get closer. So I finished my treatment. I came back to my church. They wanted me to come back as their pastor. That tells you a lot about the church and dispels some of the myths about the church. They wanted me to come back as their pastor. And then an interesting thing began to happen. I had served as a pastor again at that time for about 32 years. And over that time, pastoring sometimes very large churches, I had been the pastor of thousands and thousands of people. In that time, probably not half a dozen people had come to me with the problems with drugs and alcohol. I understood why. You kind of feel ashamed. Addiction likes to isolate us, so the addicts and active alcoholics, they're not the ones that usually come to church services, and they're not usually going to come to a minister and say, I think I have a problem with drugs or alcohol. But when I got back, I made a decision to be very open with my recovery. After all, I kind of lived in a goldfish bowl. And people knew that something was wrong, and I told them why. My first sermon, I got up before the congregation, and my first words were these: I'm Terry, and I'm an alcoholic. Well, of course, you could have heard a pin drop. But I then said this: look around you. And they did. And they looked back at me, and I said, no one died. The world did not stop when Terry admitted he was an alcoholic. So let's talk about this. And that became for me the beginning point of Chrysalis Interventions. For people started coming to me with their problems with drugs and alcohol. They knew I understood. They would ask me to help them with their husband who was drinking too much, a son who was taking drugs, a wife who had begun to drink too much. And so I began to do interventions as a kind of extension of my pastoral ministry. And then I went to training sessions, weeks of training sessions, to learn about what intervention is, learn more about alcoholism. And I became fascinated by the potential of how God can take a mess and make out of it a message, for that's what he was doing with my life. So I suppose the same thing I want to tell you today is the same thing that I learned. It's time to be free, and I wanted to be free. I wanted the guilt that I felt to be turned into innocence again. I wanted the shame to be taken away and replaced with grace. I wanted the anger that I'd stored up over the years to turn into acceptance. I wanted the resentments that had eaten away at my soul to be turned into forgiveness and compassion. I wanted the self-pity that was eating me alive to turn into gratitude. I wanted the self-centeredness to become completely a concern for God and his desire for other people through me. I wanted my doubt to be transformed into commitment. And I suppose most importantly for me, I wanted my fear to be replaced by trust. And it's all happened. I today live a life of recovery. I spent years in a darkness that I didn't even half understand. Oh, but it was dark. But today, I welcome the dawn, for it's a new day, and I can stand before the Almighty God alone and find not condemnation or loneliness or rejection, but I find love and an invitation to be free. That's my story. And if I can help you to write a new one for the loved one that is addicted in your family, let me know how I can help. Call me. Let's talk. It's time to be well.